The last weeks of the year have always interested me more than the first loud days of January. Most people think change begins when the fireworks go off. I do not. By the time the fireworks arrive, most people are already negotiating with fantasy. They are full of speeches, promises, slogans, and moods. They say they will save more. They say they will invest more. They say they will stop wasting money. They say they will finally get serious. Then life returns on Monday morning, and the old structure is still there waiting for them. The same account setup, the same recurring charges, the same bad habits, the same blind spots, the same financial fog. That is why I care more about the final quiet stretch of the year. That is when the truth is easiest to see. The calendar is almost finished. The numbers are almost complete. The excuses have fewer places to hide. And if a person is honest enough in those final weeks, he can begin the next year with something much more valuable than motivation. He can begin with structure. I have spent my life around capital, and I have noticed that people do not usually fail with money because they are incapable of understanding money. They fail because they keep entering each new year emotionally and leaving each old year intellectually blind. They do not pause long enough to ask the simplest questions. What really came in? What really went out? What produced peace? What produced stress? What was necessary? What was vanity? What was useful? What was dead weight? What looked small monthly but became enormous yearly? What the future quietly needed that the present kept stealing? A man can repeat the same 12 financial mistakes every year and still call each January a fresh start. That is not a fresh start, that is a loop. And one of the best things a person can do for his financial life is stop calling a loop a new beginning. He should call it what it is, a system. And if the system is producing the wrong result, then what needs to change is not enthusiasm, it is design. I have always liked the end of the year because it reminds me of what investors forget when markets are noisy. A record is a teacher. A good balance sheet is a teacher. A full year cash record is a teacher. Reality is a teacher. People think wisdom comes from hearing more opinions. It often comes from seeing your own numbers clearly enough that your old stories can no longer survive. That is where I would begin if I were helping an ordinary person reset his money life for the coming year. Not with a stock tip, not with a forecast, not with a prediction about what the Federal Reserve will do or whether the market will have a good quarter. I would begin with a year, end financial wrapped. I would begin with the whole year laid open. Most people know how to review their music, their steps, their sleep, their messages, their pictures, their entertainment habits, and every little digital trace of their life. Strangely, they do not know how to review their money with the same honesty. They know the songs they repeated. They do not know the mistakes they repeated. They know how many hours they streamed a show. They do not know how many hours of labor vanished into charges they barely noticed. That is backward. If you want a better financial year, the first thing you need is not confidence. It is memory, accurate memory. I would sit down with a cup of coffee or tea or something stronger if the numbers require it. And I would ask 3 simple questions. What did I really earn this year? What did I really spend this year? And what was truly left over after all of it? Those 3 questions sound basic. They are not basic in practice. A great many people do not know what they actually earned after tax across the full year, especially once bonuses, side income, rent from a room, freelance work, or any irregular income enters the picture. They know their salary headline. They do not know their real inflow. That distinction matters because people often build budgets around identity and not around cash. The headline salary flatters them. The after-tax year tells the truth. Then comes spending. This is where self-image goes to get embarrassed. Everybody thinks he has a rough idea of where his money goes. Almost nobody does. He knows the rent. He knows the mortgage. He knows the car payment. He knows the insurance. He knows the obvious obligations because those numbers arrive with enough force to be noticed. What he usually does not know is the quiet bleed, the subscriptions that became wallpaper, the delivery habits that became a weekly ritual, the shopping that was not large enough to seem irresponsible and not small enough to be harmless, the travel that felt occasional and turned out to be structural, the dining out that was less about hunger and more about fatigue, the little comforts that became expensive because they were repeated, not because they were grand. This is why a full year review matters more than a single month. A month can be explained away. A year reveals character. I like full year numbers because they strip the sentimental language off behavior. A person says, I only shop once in a while. The annual total says something else. A person says, I do not spend that much eating out. The annual total says something else. A person says, I am trying. The annual surplus or deficit tells you whether the trying was organized, and I care very much about the surplus number. In monthly budgeting, many people separate savings and investments from spending. That is perfectly reasonable for a month, month-to-month operating view. But for a year-end reset, I prefer a harsher method. I like to treat savings and investments as money already spoken for. I group them with all other outflows because I want to know what was truly left after living, after paying obligations, and after paying the future. That final remainder tells me whether there was still slack in the system that never got assigned a job. And that is useful. If a person finds that after all fixed expenses, variable expenses, savings, and investments, there was still a meaningful annual remainder, then he has learned something important. He was not as stretched as he felt. He was unallocated. That means the next year can improve dramatically without pain, because the money already existed. It was simply drifting. Drifting money is one of the saddest things in personal finance. People think they need to become stronger to save more. Often they need to become more intentional. If a person discovers at the end of the year that he had an extra $6,000 not consciously assigned, then he has just discovered $500 per month of future power that never had a mission. That is not a small revelation. That is a system problem waiting to be solved. Then there are seasonal patterns. These matter more than people think. One household overspends in winter because boredom, darkness, and emotional spending create a form of private compensation. Another overspends in summer because weddings, holidays, travel, and social events hit all at once. Another household is stable for 9 months and loses all discipline in November and December because year-end fatigue and holiday emotion turn money into therapy. I do not judge those patterns morally. I want to identify them. Once a pattern is visible, it becomes governable. Before it is visible, it governs you. That is one of the great truths of money. The things you do not measure are usually the things making the decisions for you. This is why the first year-end exercise is awareness, not punishment, not self-hatred. Awareness. You want to know where your money actually went, where your stress was born, and where your hidden capacity lives. People think budgeting is about restriction. The best budgeting is about revelation. It tells you where the truth is. Once the truth is visible, the second part becomes easier, the yearly audit. This is where I ask a different set of questions. What am I paying for that no longer deserves to exist? A great many people live inside a financial house full of old furniture they never use. Streaming services kept from one show watched 9 months ago. Apps with annual renewals. Nobody remembers authorizing gym memberships funded by guilt rather than use software tools signed up for during a burst of ambition that died in spring. Storage plans, delivery passes, premium tiers, old subscriptions, forgotten donations, duplicate services, and all the tiny recurring charges that survive. Mostly because modern banking is too frictionless. These things are not individually fatal. That is what makes them dangerous. A wolf at the door gets noticed, termites in the walls do not. The average U.S. household pays for multiple streaming services, and according to the source material, that total is often around $69 a month or more, which becomes over $800 a year without much effort at all. Felicite Fayturn 49, File 0 Fay, that figure is only for one category. The real problem is not the streaming number itself. It is the accumulation mindset behind it. Month after month, people keep funding convenience because convenience is emotionally cheap in the moment. The annual total is where convenience reveals itself as expensive. I always liked small recurring expenses as a moral test because they expose whether a person respects repetition. The world teaches people to fear large mistakes. It does not teach them to fear leaks. Yet leaks sink far more households than catastrophes. This is why I would go through every recurring payment once a year without fail subscriptions, memberships, apps, software, streaming, auto, renewals, everything. I would not ask, do I still sort of like having this? I would ask, is this helping the life I actually live right now? If the answer is no, remove it. The second part of the audit is even more profitable. Large recurring bills, phone, internet insurance, utilities where applicable, anything contractual and repetitive. These are often easier to improve than people think. The market counts on inertia. It counts on you being busy. It counts on the unpleasantness of comparing plans, switching providers, reading terms, and calling for better rates. An insurance company is not shocked that you stayed lazy. It is delighted. The source material is especially right about car insurance. It notes that insurers often let rates creep upward because they know many customers will not switch. Felicite Fayturn 49 File 0 Fay. That is not an accusation. That is a business model. A person who does not review his large recurring bills yearly is quietly consenting to a financial tax on his own passivity. I have never liked paying taxes to passivity. This is why I say a yearly audit is not about becoming cheap. It is about becoming alert. There's nothing wrong with paying for things that improve your life. There is something foolish about paying old prices for old arrangements that no longer deserve your money, merely because the bill was small enough to become invisible. Once waste is trimmed, the next stage matters even more: rebuilding the foundation. This is where most resolutions fail because people want to invest before they are structurally ready. They want to feel like investors. They are not yet behaving like stewards. The first layer of the foundation is emergency liquidity. Do you have enough to carry 3 to 6 months of essential expenses if the machine goes cold? The answer must be built from current reality, not old memory. A person who built an emergency fund 5 years ago may think he is safe because he still has the same nominal amount. But if housing, transportation, childcare, food, insurance, and obligations have all grown, then the same reserve now buys fewer months of protection than it once did. That matters. A reserve is not measured only by its size. It is measured by its durability against current expenses. This is another place where inflation quietly humiliates people who are not updating their assumptions. They think I still have the fund. But the fund has been shortened by the cost of living. That is why I would reprice the reserve every year, not sentimentally, mathematically. What does my actual life cost now? What would 3 months of survival mean now? What would 6 months mean? That is the number. Not the number you saved years ago and kept because it sounded complete. Then comes the relationship between cash and investment here. People usually make one of two mistakes. Either they hold far too much cash because it feels emotionally safe, or they push every available dollar into the market and leave themselves fragile. I dislike both extremes. Too much cash beyond emergency need is often just inflation politely eating your purchasing power while you call it safety. Too little cash forces you to liquidate good assets at bad times for stupid reasons. A person should not be forced to sell productive ownership because the transmission failed or the roof gave up in January. That is why I always say cash has jobs. It is there for resilience, not for long-term growth. Anything meaningfully above emergency need that is not required in the next several years should probably be examined for more productive use. The source material says much the same thing, noting that cash above emergency needs and not required in the next 5 years should often be considered for investing because inflation slowly erodes its value. Fay Philocite, Fay turn 49, file 0 Fay. That is the right instinct. Not because the market is guaranteed to be kind on your schedule, because a long life funded only by idle cash is almost always a losing proposition. Then comes one of my favorite categories of money: free money. The world is stingy enough that when free money exists, I want it collected promptly. Employer matching in retirement plans is one of the cleanest examples. If an employer offers a match and a worker does not contribute enough to collect it, then he is not merely delaying investment. He is refusing a compensation stream that already belongs in the arithmetic of his life. That is deeply foolish. I have very little patience for people who say they are trying to build a better future while voluntarily leaving employer match money on the table. That is not a strategy problem. That is failure to recognize an immediate return. The source material says this plainly and correctly. Employer matching is among the easiest forms of free money most workers will ever see. Fay Philocite, Fay turn 49, file 0 Fay. The same general logic applies to tax allowances, tax shelters, and legal mechanisms. The system provides if you are awake enough to use them. Different countries handle these differently. The source text mentions calendar year and non-calendar year deadlines, charitable tax benefits, and tax loss harvesting in jurisdictions where those tools apply. Fay Philocite, Fay turn 49, file 0 Fay. The principle is larger than any one country. Know when your tax year matters, know which shelters exist, know what resets, know what expires unused. I do not enjoy paying unnecessary tax out of laziness, any more than I enjoy paying too much for insurance out of laziness. The point is not to become obsessive. The point is to stop being vague. Vagueness is very expensive in personal finance. Now, once the past has been examined, waste trimmed, the foundation rebuilt, and free money collected, the obvious next step is direction. But here again, most people fail because they confuse aspiration with planning. They say, I want to be better with money. That is not a goal. They say, I want to save more. That is not a goal either. It is a wish wearing responsible clothing. A goal must be concrete enough to govern behavior. If you want to save $6,000 by year end, then that means $500 per month. If 500 is not realistic, then the target or the time horizon must change. I have never understood why people think lying to themselves in January counts as ambition. A goal should stretch you. It should not require fantasy. The source material is exactly right, that next year money needs direction. Fay file a site Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay direction changes decision. Making a person with no clear purpose for his money spends opportunistically. A person with a clear target can ask of each decision, does this serve the target or attack it? That is a very different life. So I would write down 1 or 2 real goals, not 7, not 12, 1 or 2 that actually matter. Emergency fund fully restored, credit card gone. First investment account started, house deposit funded to a specific number. Retirement contribution increased to a specific level. Specific numbers, specific dates, specific monthly actions. People think this is restrictive. I think it is relieving. Money without direction drifts toward the loudest desire. Money with direction starts behaving like a worker. That is a better arrangement. Then comes the final piece. And this is where nearly all the benefits of the prior work can be lost if the system is not built properly. Your money operating system, I like that phrase because it describes the truth. A financial life is not mainly a collection of good intentions. It is an operating system. Inputs, outputs, rules, triggers, automations, friction. If the system depends on willpower every month, the system will fail under ordinary human conditions. People get tired, distracted, sick, overworked, emotional. They forget, they delay, they reward themselves, they rationalize. That is not unusual. That is life, which is why the good system must work, even when the person is not feeling wise. This means automating the right moves. Savings transfers, investment contributions, retirement contributions, bill payments, sinking funds for irregular but predictable expenses. I especially like sinking funds because they convert what feels like a surprise into something structurally expected. Car repairs are not really surprises. Birthdays are not surprises. Annual insurance is not a surprise. Holiday travel is not a surprise. What people mean is that they were not prepared. Preparation is cheaper than drama. The source text is strong on this point too, especially in the idea of giving every dollar a job in advance instead of spending on the fly. Fay Felicite Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay, that is the essence of a good system. Do not wait for each paycheck to arrive before starting a fresh negotiation with your impulses. Pre-decide where the money goes, then let the machine move it. Another part of a good operating system is friction design. James Clear gives a nice example in the source text about greeting cards sorted by occasion, so the desired behavior becomes easier to perform. Fay Felicite Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay. That principle belongs in money too. If you want to protect an emergency fund, keep it somewhere separate enough that raiding it feels inconvenient. If you want to invest consistently, make the transfer simple and automatic. If shopping emails trigger you, remove them. If checking your progress encourages you, make the dashboard easy to see. A lot of people fail financially not because they lack moral strength, but because their environment is built to reward bad decisions and complicate good ones. A better environment is not cheating, it is wisdom. And yes, I would keep a simple dashboard, not something theatrical, not 6 apps and 17 charts. Just something that tells the truth quickly. Cash debt, savings rate, investment balance, target progress. You do not need constant stimulation from money. You need clean visibility. Most people think money management should feel active. The best systems feel calm. They do their work in the background while you live. That is the goal. A life where money is organized enough that it supports a good life instead of becoming the main emotional weather system in the house. That is why I like a year-end reset done this way. It is not mainly about cutting expenses. It is not mainly about investing more. It is not mainly about discipline in the moral sense. It is about becoming honest enough to see the machine you built, brave enough to subtract what is dead, wise enough to reinforce the foundation, alert enough to collect what is already yours, disciplined enough to choose a direction, and practical enough to build a system that does not depend on January excitement to keep functioning in August. That is how real financial improvement happens. Quietly, rationally, without theatrics. The last weeks of the year can be used one of 2 ways. You can drift through them, exhausted, comfort yourself with the idea that next year will somehow be different, and then hand January to the same structure that produced this year, or you can sit down, look reality in the eye, and re-engineer the machine before the calendar turns. One of those paths feels easier for a week, the other feels better for a year. I know which one I would choose, not because it sounds admirable, because it works. And in money, what works quietly is usually worth far more than what sounds exciting loudly.